Okay, everyone, so in this tutorial, we're going to look at how to make a pivot table in Excel 2016. So the first thing I want to do is make sure there aren't any extraneous rows or columns. Sometimes at work, when I generate a report, a blank column is A. For some reason, you're going to want to remove that if the same thing happens to you. Likewise, sometimes if someone runs a report for me, the top row is a title or a date. Again, you're going to want to remove that. You don't want any extraneous rows or columns. You want the top row to be your data headers. Okay, so let's begin. Let's click on Insert. We click on Pivot Table, and you're going to see a pop-up window that is instructing you to do two things if they haven't done already. A, what is the data range? B, where do you want the pivot table to be placed? Now, in this case, it automatically selected the data range. You can see the dotted line. I'll move this window out of the way. You can see that it perfectly selected the data. However, if it does not, you can click on this little arrow and just manually select it yourself. Just like that. The second part is where it's going to place it. Again, this might default to new worksheet or it might default to existing worksheet. Overwhelming majority of the time, you're probably going to want to put this in a new worksheet, particularly if your data is pretty extensive and goes out 10, 15, 20 columns. There's really no benefit to having the pivot table embedded right there. You probably want it on its own worksheet. However, in this case, I'm going to change this to existing worksheet. That way you can easily see how the data relates to the pivot table and vice versa. So let's click here, just choose a location, and you don't have to select a whole area. You're just saying what the starting cell is, and then click on OK. Great, so far so good. So let's take a moment to actually look at what we have in the data. We have client name, we have transaction amount, the category where that money was spent, and the store number in which it occurred. So this is basically retail store transactions, and maybe this is a report being viewed by like a district manager. As this tutorial goes on, I'm actually going to add at least one more column. I just don't want it to be too complex at first. So one of the great things about pivot tables is you get to determine how you want this to be configured. Do you want it to be client-centric? Do you want it to be store-centric? Do you want it to be category-centric? What do you want to be the overall story the pivot table is telling you? So over here, you'll see that you have different elements. These elements, these fields, match, unsurprisingly, the columns. Down here in the lower right corner is where you'll put those various elements to make the table. We have rows, values, and columns. Now I mentioned making this a customer or client-centric table, so you'd put something here in row. If you want it to be store-centric, it would be in row. At least that's the way my mind works. Columns and rows are a little bit interchangeable, but we're going to really take a focus on row being the driving force of the table. Likewise, values, if you add something to a value, it creates a column. So seeing columns and values, it's a little bit misleading that they call this columns, but don't want to get ahead. You'll see how that works. So how do we add something to the table? You just left click and drag and drop it. So we're going to left click, drag and drop name to rows. And so it's taken all these repeating values and turned them into unique values. So you only see one entry for each one. Doesn't really tell us much. So say we want to know how many transactions occur. So basically these are the names that occur in this row, in this column. Now you want to know how many rows of each. So if you take name again and drag and drop it to value, since it is not a numeric field, it's a text field, it is doing a count because it can't do a sum. It's not a number. It only can count occurrences. And so it says there's 5 of Chris, 4 of Claire, 6 of Jill, 4 of Leon, and 3 of Rebecca. So let's look at the highest one, Jill, 6. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So that is what that's telling you. It's telling you that Jill appears 6 times in this report. But maybe you don't really care about how many times they appear, that just the amount of occurrences really doesn't matter. You really want to know a dollar amount. So you don't have to completely start from scratch. All you need to do is see how there's a little drop down arrow next to these elements. You could just click and choose Remove Field. So what do we want here instead? We want Amount. So you're going to left click, drag and drop Amount. And if you notice, it's a total, it's a sum. So rather than doing a count, since it's numeric, you could automatically, or should I say the system will automatically set it up as a sum instead of a count. The name is a text field, so it does a count. This is a numeric field, so it does a sum. But there's other functions you can do as well. So let's take a look at that. So say you want both. You want sum and the count. So you could take name, put it back here where you want, and say this looks kind of weird. You really don't want the sum first. You want the count first. So you can left click on an element and just push it up until you see this like horizontal green line, and then drop it. So you can see it's reversed position. So basically top to bottom is left to right. So this will be first, this will be second, so on and so forth. So okay, you have the count, you have the sum, but maybe you want an average because that's really kind of what this is getting at, isn't it? Yes, an absolute number is nice, but you also want to know your average sales amount. Particularly in a retail environment, that's when the number that flies around is how much does the average, what is the average transaction amount? Although it's usually looked at store level or it's looked at chain level, not really customer level, but it's certainly still valid. So let's take amount again, put it back down here. Now it gives you sum again, because again, it is automatically choosing this by default. So you can change that. So the bottom here where it says sum, you can click on the drop down arrow, and this time I'm going to choose value field settings. In here, it's telling you can do a sum, a count, average, max, min, product. Keeps on going, standard deviation. So we're going to do average because we said we wanted to know what the average transaction is. And there you go. You now have the average. You have how many transactions, the sum amount of the transactions, and now your average. Now, as a little bonus, this doesn't look very good. You really don't need to go out that many decimal places, so there's a couple things you can do. You can select these, so left click and drag. You can then right click and you can format these like any other cells. So you could choose currency, and you can have, say, 2 decimal places, and just like that, it cleans it up. Now you just have to keep in mind, though, that you formatted spaces, so depending on what you have there could create an issue. So we're just going to undo that. In other words, you don't want to apply formatting to something that you don't want to apply currency formatting to something that isn't currency. So that would be one of the last things you do once you've decided what you want. But we've got a few more things to demonstrate. Okay, so as you notice, I clicked outside and the fields disappeared. Don't panic, just click back on the table and you'll see the fields again. So let's now make a change to what we have here. What we're going to do, we're going to change the data set itself. We're going to add a column, we're going to call it refund. And we'll just randomly say some of these are a yes, some of these are no. And it really doesn't matter which ones I'm choosing as yes or no. I just need to demonstrate another function. All right, so what we did is we changed the data source. So what we're going to do is you're just going to go ahead and delete this because as you can see, it's easy to recreate. So we're just going to delete that. We're going to go back to Insert, Pivot Table, and as you can see, it automatically selected the data, including the new column. Again, if it doesn't, you can click here and then manually select it yourself. And we're going to, again, go back to existing worksheet, choose that as the location, and click on OK. So what do we want to do this time? Well, this time, a total won't work because the transaction, in some cases, is refunded. So if you add those in, you're coming up with an inflated number. So let's drag name down to row, and then let's drag amount to value. So far, so good. We did that. But now we're going to take that refund and we're going to put it here in column. And like I said, column is a little misleading because by adding a value, you added a column. But you'll see what happens when we do this. So you take refund, drag and drop it to column. And now what it's doing, it's breaking this down into a secondary criteria. It's saying, was the transaction refunded or was it refunded, yes or no? So by doing this, this grand total is what we were seeing before. So if we remove refund, see 250, 275, 275, bring refund back, 250, 275, 275. So we were inherently seeing the total because it wasn't breaking it down into the two types. Now by separating the refunds from the non-refunds, you can actually see that the numbers are lower, that this is the amount that was not refunded. Now you could argue whether or not a table would be set up like this. Maybe there'd be a separate transaction line for a refund and it's set up as a negative. Just trying to show you how you can set up conditions. So what this would do is this would show you, again, you've broken down which one is a refund and which one is not. Now, from a client customer point of view, you may or may not care about this. Maybe you do because you're looking to see if maybe there's one person who keeps coming back over and over again. So let's now change, rather than this being client or customer centric, let's make it store centric. So let's make it location centric. So we're just going to get rid of these fields. And again, by deleting the field here, you're not deleting it from here, you're not deleting it from here, you're just removing it from the current configuration. So we're going to make this store centric. So we're going to take store number and put it into row. And so now you're going to see what kind of activity is happening within the store. Now, we were talking about refunds. Maybe there are certain stores that have higher refund amounts than other stores. Maybe there is fraudulent activity there. Maybe there are scammers there. Maybe the staffing is just more, they're a little more lax with enforcement of refund policy. There's a lot of reasons why you could see an increase. This is just trying to show you if there's an increase. This is trying to find the high-low marks. This is trying to find the anomalies. This is trying to determine if there's something that stands out. So it could be a red flag. So what we do is we now take amount and put it into values. So you now can see amount. And then we take refund and put it into columns. So what you've done now is you've gone from a customer-centric breakdown of refunds and non-refunds to a store breakdown of refunds and non-refunds. And the random numbers I put into the data set really don't evidence anything. You do have a range. This is on the low end, this is on the high end, and this is somewhere towards the middle. Not quite. It'd have to be, I think, 120, 112. I think it'd have to be about 112.50 to be in the middle. Anyways, but what you've done now is you've taken the same data set and now Again, rather than being client-centric, it's now store-centric. So maybe this is a regional manager trying to figure out what's going on. Are there a lot of refunds? Yes or no, that kind of thing. Maybe it's not really refunds you care about. Maybe it's category. What category gets all the sales? Maybe maybe there's not good signage or something like that, because again, we're talking retail environment. So what you can do is you can take that category and you can make that a column as well. So this is where pivot tables start getting a little bit messy looking, because now you have these multiple conditions. So you're seeing, was this refunded? No. Was this refunded? Yes. What amounts were not refunded? What amounts were refunded? That may or may not be the way you want to see it. Just as we switch the order for values, changing the left to right order, you can switch these here to change the top-down order. So I can put category on top, and maybe that makes a little bit more sense. So you're looking at clothes, refund, no, refund, yes. Entertainment, no, yes. Food, no, yes. So again, when you start adding the columns, it really does start making it a little bit messier, but it does give you that breakdown of what you want. You can, again, maybe there is a certain type of refund that's happened in a certain category in a certain store. That's what you're really drilling down at. You're trying to drill down at those specific conditions. And I think that's about it for this tutorial. Now that I've shown you rows, values, and columns, you really can take it from here and apply this to whatever data you're trying to slice and dice. If there's a specific example you want, feel free to let me know. As I said, the example I took was meant to be a transaction data set that includes location, includes category, includes whether or not it was refunded. So typical kind of retail operations, particularly from a regional or corporate level. But maybe there's something specific you're trying to look at. Maybe you're looking at defects for parts. Maybe you're looking at shrinkage. Maybe you have a ticket tracker. Like, for instance, rather than having customer name, you would have associate name who took the call or took the email, and they're trying to do a problem resolution. You're tracking all these problem resolutions. So rather than amount spent, maybe you're looking at duration of call. So with that, you could do something like the associate name, how many calls did they take, as opposed to how many purchases were made. The amount, again, would rather be dollar amount, would be, say, call, how long the call lasted. So you could do a sum total of how much time they were on the phone. You could then do an average of what's their average call. So just by changing the content of these columns, the same functionality works. The same functionality works exactly the same way. And in that case, it was a ticket tracker. So again, if there's a specific example you want, please let me know, but I think that should do it for this one.